Chapter 1. The Barn and the Bible. The morning sun stretched its golden arms across the rolling fields, painting the tall grass in soft shades of green and gold. 8-year-old Daniel had already finished his chores, feeding the chickens, gathering the eggs, and hauling a bucket of water from the well. His boots were muddy, his hands smelled faintly of hay, but his eyes sparkled with the kind of joy only a child could carry so easily. Clutched tightly in his small hands was a well-worn Bible. Its leather cover was scratched from years of use, though it had belonged to his grandfather long before it was his. The pages were thin and crinkled, but Daniel loved the way they sounded when he turned them, like whispers that only he and God could hear. He pushed open the barn door, and it creaked in greeting. Inside, the air was warm and rich with the scent of hay and the soft nickers of the horses. But one horse in particular stood waiting for him. Her name was Star, a gentle chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. She leaned her head over the stall door as if she had been expecting him all along. "Morning, Star," Daniel said with a grin. "I brought the good book today." Star blew warm breath over his cheek as if approving. Daniel pulled an old, upturned crate across the floor and sat down, resting the Bible in his lap. The barn grew quiet, except for the rustle of straw and the steady breathing of the animals. It was the kind of quiet that made Daniel feel closer to heaven. He opened to a page where a little bookmark, a piece of red ribbon his mother had tied for him, rested between the chapters. Daniel licked his finger, carefully turned the page, and began to read aloud. His young voice filled the barn, full of innocence and earnestness. "The Lord is my shepherd," he started, glancing up now and then at Star. The mare watched him with patient eyes, as if every word was meant for her alone. Daniel read slowly, savoring each line, stumbling over the bigger words but never stopping. To him, the barn wasn't just a place for cows and horses. It was his sanctuary. And Star wasn't just a horse. She was his congregation. Sometimes he imagined that Star understood everything he read. When Daniel read about courage, her ears flicked forward as though she agreed. When he spoke about peace, she would nuzzle his shoulder, making him grin wide. And when the verses spoke of love, Daniel felt the warmth spread through him, like the whole barn had been wrapped in God's arms. That morning, Daniel closed the Bible after a few passages and sighed happily. "I think you like that one," he told her. "I like it too. Makes me feel like I'm never alone." Star bobbed her head as though she wanted to say yes, and Daniel laughed, resting his forehead against her soft muzzle. The laughter was light, but the feeling behind it was deep. An 8-year-old boy finding comfort in a quiet barn, in the simple presence of his horse, and in words that had been carried across centuries, now landing in his small and faithful heart. Chapter 2. 10 years later. The barn hadn't changed much in 10 years. The same wide beams held its roof high. The same door still groaned on its hinges, and the smell of hay and oats still clung to the air like a memory that never faded. But Daniel had changed. At 18, he was taller now, his shoulders broad from farm work, and his hands carried the calluses of a young man who knew responsibility. Yet in many ways he was still the same boy who once dragged a worn Bible into the barn to read to his horse. The Bible was still with him, its leather edges softer than before, the pages more frayed, with dozens of folded corners marking passages that had become part of his life. And Star was still there too, waiting in the same stall. Her once bright chestnut coat, now carrying the gentler hues of age. Daniel slid the barn door open just as he used to, and Star lifted her head at the sound. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and Daniel felt a smile tug at his lips. "Guess I never outgrew this habit, did I, girl?" he said, patting her neck. "Still got some reading to do." He pulled over the old crate, though it wobbled more under his weight these days, and sat down, Bible in hand. His voice was deeper now, fuller, but the tenderness in his words hadn't changed. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," he began, letting the words settle into the rafters, into the straw, into Star's listening ears. The rhythm of reading, the intimacy of the barn, made time feel like it folded in on itself. He was 8 again, wide-eyed and unsteady with the words, and he was 18, steady and sure. Sometimes he paused to stroke Star's muzzle. She leaned close, her breathing slow and steady, and Daniel felt that same old sense of being understood, even if she never spoke a word. Life was more complicated now. Daniel thought often about the future, about leaving the farm, about whether God had a calling waiting beyond these fields, and about how to step into a world bigger than he had ever known. But in the barn, with Star and the Bible, everything made sense again. "This is where I hear him clearest," Daniel whispered, almost to himself. He pressed a hand to the weathered cover of the Bible. "And somehow I think you hear him too." Star nickered softly, nudging his shoulder, and Daniel chuckled. "See? You've always had good ears." The light through the open loft window slipped across the barn floor, making the dust sparkle like gold in the afternoon sun. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the peace of it all. He understood now, more than ever, that these moments weren't just habit or routine. They were holy, sacred whispers shared between a young man, his faithful horse, and the God who had walked with him since boyhood. Chapter 3. One Last Reading. The years moved quickly once Daniel left the farm. He had gone off with dreams larger than the rolling fields he'd known as a boy, studies, work, responsibilities in towns and cities that never seemed to rest. Yet no matter where he was, his heart always carried the echo of the barn, the smell of hay, the soft warmth of a horse's breath, and the steady comfort of the Bible in his hands. 10 more years passed before he finally returned. Now 28, Daniel drove up the long gravel drive with a slower, more thoughtful pace. The farmhouse leaned a little heavier, and the barn bore the wear of years more openly. But they stood tall, waiting for him. When he pushed open the barn door, the familiar creak sounded like an old friend greeting him. And there she was, Star. Older, her coat dulled with gray streaks, her movements slower. But when she lifted her head and saw him, her eyes held the same warmth she had carried since the day he was 8. Daniel's throat tightened as he walked to her stall. "Hey, girl," he whispered, running a hand along her neck. "It's been too long. I'm sorry." Her ears flicked forward, as though she forgave him instantly. Daniel found the old crate still tucked in the corner. It groaned beneath his weight now. But he lowered himself onto it, setting his Bible in his lap. He hadn't forgotten this place, this rhythm. Only this time, every word felt heavier, more urgent, like he was reading them for the very last time. He opened the book, smoothed the fragile pages, and began in a steady, quiet voice. "Let not your heart be troubled." As his words filled the barn once more, Star stood close, her head bowed low as though she were listening more deeply than ever before. Daniel read slowly, stopping at passages that had guided him through his wandering years. Words of hope, words of light, words about dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. Each verse felt like a thread, weaving together the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the love that had never faded between him and his faithful horse. When he finally closed the Bible, he rested his forehead against Star's. "Thank you for listening all these years," he said softly. "You've been my friend, my church, my family." "You're the best sermon I ever gave." Star breathed one last steady breath, warm against his cheek, and then, as if the words had carried her home, she grew still. Daniel held her as tears stung his eyes, his chest tight with both sorrow and peace. The barn was quiet, filled with sunlight streaming through the cracks in the wood, and Daniel knew this was a holy moment. He had read to her one final time, and she had stayed to hear it. As he closed the Bible and laid a hand gently on her, Daniel whispered through his tears, "You're with him now, Star." In the stillness, Daniel realized something. The words he had read in that barn all his life weren't meant to stay bound between walls of cedar and hay. They were alive, meant to be carried outward just as faithfully as he had carried them inward. Star had been his listener, his church of one. But now, perhaps it was time to share those words with others. He left the barn as the evening sun washed the fields in gold. Behind him, he carried the sorrow of parting, but ahead, he felt the quiet certainty of calling. Star had taught him what it meant to speak God's word with love, no matter the audience. She had listened when no one else would. And now, Daniel knew he was ready to let the world listen too. As he glanced back one last time, the barn glowed in the fading light, like a sanctuary closing its doors. Daniel smiled through his tears and carried the Bible close to his chest. Star had heard the final verse. Now, it was Daniel's turn to live it.